Hello, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we'll be providing an official introduction into using functions. Specifically, we'll be going over what functions are. We'll be talking about several different facets of using functions, such as function calls, return values, and function chaining. We're also going to explore a reference on php.net, which is a function reference that provides documentation for all of the built-in functions to PHP. And then part of that is we're going to go over optional function arguments, which we'll learn about as we go through. And then we're going to cover some common functions for three different in three different groups: string functions, array functions, and then date and time functions. So I said this, the title of this course or this lesson is an official introduction to functions, and the reason I said that is because we've actually been using functions already. We were first introduced with the PHP info function that outputs all of the information about a PHP configuration. We've also used other functions like the var dump function that outputs the type and value information of a variable. So we actually have used them before. Now we're just going to officially talk about what a function is. Basically, a function is a group of statements that can sort of be executed on demand, and it's essentially a section of code that usually performs a specific task. For example, getting the length of a string, and this is a task you might perform over and over again. So you set it aside in a block of code, and then you name it, and then what you can do is you make what's known as a function call, which is a way to invoke that section of code and perform the function that you need. Basically what happens is when PHP is processing a script and it reaches a function call, it stops execution of the current script, goes to where the function is defined, runs the function code, and then returns back to the original PHP script after performing the function. Now, as mentioned, PHP has a built-in library of functions that provide commonly needed tasks, such as working with strings, working with arrays, and working with dates and times, which are all things we're going to learn about in this lesson. There are also many extensions that are built into PHP, such as a MySQL extension for using the database, and so those are built in as well. So how do function calls look, and in particular, like how do you make a function call? Well, we've used them before with PHP info and var dump, and essentially a function call which requests the execution of the code defined in the function is simply the name of the function and then a pair of opening and closing parentheses. In this case, the time function is a built-in PHP function, and it gets a current timestamp of the date and time right at the moment. So that's an example of a function with what's called no arguments. There are also functions and a lot of functions, most functions accept arguments. And basically what arguments are is expressions provided in between the parentheses of a function. And basically it's a way to pass data and information into the function so that it can work on it. For example, here we have a built-in PHP function called string_len. And basically what this function does is it returns the length of a string that you pass in as a function argument. In this case, our function argument is the string ABC. And so what happens is when this line of code right here is run, when PHP gets to the string_len function call, it stops execution, goes out to the string_len function code, uses this value right here that was input as a function argument to the function, and returns the length of that string, and that's the particular function of the string_len function. So in this case it would return the value of 3. And one thing to note is that functions expect their argument values to be of a certain type. In this case, for example, the string length, obviously you pass in a string. And one thing to note is that if you pass a function arguments that aren't of the correct type, the return value, which we'll learn about in a minute, of a function is undefined, which basically is stating that the way the function will work is unknown. Another thing to also mention is that sometimes you'll refer arguments or function arguments referred to as parameters. So we just mentioned the term return values, and basically what that means is a function like variables and literals are expressions. And because we know from our lesson on expressions, functions is something that has a value. So a function has a value. And what a function's value is known as its return value, this phrase right here. And basically what it is when the function executes, it will return a value to the original script where it was called from. So for example, if we have this line of code right here, we have a message variable, and we have a string literal, and we're concatenating to it using the concatenation operator we had learned about, the output or the value of the string lang function with the argument ABC. Now we just learned that string lang is a function that outputs the length of the string that's passed into it as an argument. So what's going to happen is when PHP reaches this section of code right here, it's going to go and evaluate the string lang function. String lang is going to give a return value of 3, so that's the value of the function, and it's going to essentially replace it in line. So instead of having this anymore, we have 3, because 3 is the value of the function, or the return value of the function. So essentially, this line up here would end up with you'd end up with the message that has a string literal length is 3. Now, one thing that you can do with functions is known as function chaining. And because functions take expressions as their arguments, and a function, as we just learned, is an expression itself, it has a return value, you can use a function call as an argument to another function. So for example, PHP has a built-in function called getDate. And it accepts one argument that's a timestamp, what's known as a Unix timestamp, which we'll get to in a few slides. And what it does is it outputs an array of date information. So what you can do is you can use the time function, which creates a timestamp, as the argument to the getDate function. So what happens in this case, when this line gets evaluated here, PHP goes to evaluate this function, and then it sees that its argument is a function itself, so it goes out, it finds the time function, it executes the time function, and whatever value that returns, it then passes that value into getDate, and getDate uses that to produce its output. And functions can be chained together as sort of many levels deep as needed. For example, there's also a function called implode that we're going to learn about. And you can actually, for the function implode, what it takes is an array as its second argument, as we'll find out. And because getDate returns an array, you can use getDate as its argument. And additionally, we learned that getDate takes a timestamp, and because the time function returns a value that's a timestamp, you can include that as the argument to getDate, and you can include this whole function chain as an argument to the method implode. So one nice thing about PHP is that it has a lot of built-in functionality. And at php.net, there's a documentation known as the function reference that provides information about all of the built-in functions provided by PHP. Specifically, one of the things it provides are function prototypes, which are basically descriptions of how to use the function. It describes the arguments and the types of arguments a function takes, as well as what values it returns. Additionally, the documentation also just has some general information about what the different functions do. It's part of the PHP manual, and you can find it at this address, which we're going to go to in a second. And it documents all of the core built-in PHP functions, as well as the PHP functions provided by common extensions. For example, MySQL database it's common to interact with a MySQL database using PHP, and so that's a common extension. So in this function reference at php.net, you can find information about the functions provided by the MySQL extension. So let's actually go take a look at the php.net function reference. And basically the way that you would get there is actually if we go to the PHP homepage, and then you select documentation at the top of the page in English. It brings you to the PHP manual, which we've gone to before. And if you scroll down in the PHP manual, there's a section called function reference. And if we click on that, that brings us to the function reference for PHP. And basically what it does is, let me blow it up a little bit, is it lists all of the, by category, all of the different functions that are built into PHP or provided by extensions. So for example, if we scroll down, you can see all sorts of different functions that are provided. And we look in the text processing category. There's a subcategory called strings, which is function is an extension or part of the PHP core that provides string functions. And so when we go to the strings function library or the strings function reference, you can see there's a link called string functions. And if we click on that, basically what it does is it lists all of the different string functions that are available to you as a PHP programmer. If we go down and we look at a function we had talked about, let's see, where is it? The string length function, and we click on that. Here we can see what we just talked about as a function prototype. What this says is it gives the name of the function, string len in this case, and then it defines the arguments that the function accepts. In this case, it accepts a string argument, and basically in the sections below, it describes what the arguments are meant to be, and so this identifier right here is used below. For example, the first parameter is called string, so when you go down and look at the more documentation, you look at the parameters list, you can see string, and it tells you that this argument is the string being measured for length. Additionally, what you can tell is that this function to the left of the function name is its return value. And so this shows that this function, string length, returns an integer. And actually, if you look further down, there's also a section on return values. And in this case, it says the length of the string parameter on success is returned. And if not, if the string is an empty string, it returns 0. So this sort of provides information. It gives a description of what the function does, and then it provides information about how you would call the function. You would know to call it by passing it a string as an argument, and it also provides information about knowing what sort of result you should get from it, what value it will give you. In this case, we know that it's an integer value. So one other thing that you can do in PHP is functions can have optional arguments. So for example, you might have a function that can take one argument, or it can take 2 arguments, or maybe sometimes it can take even 3 arguments. Functions can be specified so that they have required arguments and then also any number of optional arguments. Well, the PHP manual's function reference that we just looked at has a way of denoting optional arguments to functions, which is important. So when you go to look at the manual to review different functions that you may want to use, you'll understand that they're optional functions. So if we actually go and look at the date function, and one of the nice things about the PHP website is it actually at the top of the screen has a search box, and it says search for and it has a drop-down box, and you can select by default function list. And if you type the name of the function that you're looking for, in this case we're looking for the function date, and we hit enter, it'll bring you to the function description page for the date function. And here again we have a function prototype. It says the function's name is date. It returns a string. And then here's where it says it accepts as its first parameter, which is a required parameter, a string, and they're calling it format. And then the way it signifies its second parameter as optional is by including it in square brackets. So because this first parameter is not specified by square or enclosed in square brackets, this is a required parameter. However, because the second parameter or argument is included in square brackets, that lets you know as a programmer that you don't have to provide that. But what it also does tell you is if you do provide the optional parameter, it tells you that it needs to be of the integer data type. Additionally, for optional arguments, they always have default values. So here you can see that basically what happens if you don't provide this optional argument when you call this function, it's going to implicitly assign to this second argument the value of the time function in this case. So it's going to say if you just call date with one argument, you're going to provide a string to it, and then for the second parameter, it's automatically just going to use the output of the time function. So now we're going to talk about some commonly used functions as they relate to strings. Strings you work with a lot in PHP as we're constantly outputting and changing around HTML text. And PHP has a wealth of built-in string functions. And this is a list of some of the common ones. And we're going to go through some examples using these functions. These first two, basically, as the name kind of implies, they basically are used to convert a string that you pass into it as an argument to an uppercase or to all uppercase or all lowercase. So actually, if we go look at a page we've created for this lesson called stringfunctions.php, we can see let's blow this up a little more, a code example of using the string to upper function. And basically its use, this is my version of the function prototype. It says it's string to upper, and it takes a string, one parameter as its value, which is a string. So here we have an example of calling the string to upper function, and it would use this syntax here. Here we're passing it the value C lowercase a, which would be a abbreviation for the state of California. And when if we were to output the value of this function, it would output capital C, capital A. And additionally, here we have the string to lower function, which is similar, except that when you pass it a string value, it converts it all to lowercase letters. Now, one thing to note, if we actually go and look at the source code behind this, is that in double-quoted strings, we often can output variables, or we can output variables using variable interpolation. However, even though a function is an expression value, you can include a function call within double-quoted strings. So for example, for this first part, for the string to upper function example, what we've done is actually called the string to upper function on this CA string and assigned it to a variable. And then what we've done is in our output statement, we've included that variable within our double-quoted string, so we'll echo it out. And that's because you couldn't actually replace upper with this, as that wouldn't work, and PHP wouldn't know how to evaluate that. However, what you can do, if we look at the string to lower example, instead of having this extra step where we create a variable and then supply the variable to the echo statement, we can use the concatenation operator, which we learned about. And so we put the initial part of our output message. We close that string, and then we call the string to lower function on the string variable, which here is matthewm@educator.com, for example. This function is going to go out and run and return the value, which is a string in lowercase. It's going to add that string by concatenation to this original output string, and then it's going to concatenate at the end a break statement. So that's one thing to just be aware of, is that you can include functions within double-quoted strings as you can variables. So some of the other functions that PHP provides are an implode. It's called implode, which basically it converts an array into a delimited string. We're going to look at that in a second. And there's a string replace function. And what you can do with that function is replace all the occurrences of a certain string within another string with a replacement string. So for example, you have a string maybe 50 characters long and it contains the character A 5 times. You could use the string replace function to replace the character A with B. We also have the explode function, which is basically sort of the converse of the implode function, which takes a delimited string and it deconstructs it into an array. There's the string position function. And basically what that does is you pass it a string and a character sequence that you're interested in finding in that string, and it returns the position of where that character sequence occurs in the string. There's the substring function, which is going to allows you to return a specified portion of a string. And then the string length function, which we have talked about, which basically returns the length of a string. So let's go take a look at some of these functions in action. If we look at our stringfunctions.php file again in our web browser, here we can see the use of the implode And basically the way implode works is you pass it a delimiter and you pass it an array. And what it does is it takes all the values from the array and creates a string where they're delimited by the delimiter that you pass into it. So in this example, we've passed to implode the colon delimiter, and we passed to it an array containing 3 different values. It's got 2 strings and a integer. And what the string that this implode function would output is right here. And as you can see, it's a string of all the values in the array delimited by colons. Now, one thing that we could do is, let's say we change our mind and we don't want to use colon as the delimiter in the string. Well, we can use the string replace function to replace it with a different delimiter. And the way that works is it has 3 arguments. The first one is the string that you want to replace, which can be 1 or multiple characters. It has the replacement string that you want to put in its place, and then it also has the other third argument is the actual string that you'll be searching to do the replacement in. So in this case, the string we want to replace is the colon character, and we want to replace it with a comma. And the string that we're going to perform this replacement operation on is the delimited string that we had up here, which is the the array values separated by colons. And once the output of this string replace function is then going to give us this right here, which is a comma delimited list of the 3 values in the array. Now we're going to demonstrate the explode function, which is again sort of the converse of the implode function, which takes as a delimited array, or excuse me, it takes a delimited string and deconstructs it into an array. So the way explode works is you pass it 2 values. You pass it as a second parameter the string that you want to extrapolate into its parts, and then you provide the delimiter that you want to use to divide that you're going to use to know where to divide the string up. So in our case, because we've replaced the colons with commas in our string, we're going to explode using the comma as our delimiter, and we're going to pass it the string, the comma delimited string. And what that's going to do, as you can see for the output, is it's going to output an array of length 3, and what it's going to do is it's going to extract everything before the first comma into the first value of the array. It's going to extract everything after before the second comma into the second value of the array, and so on. So here you can say we have an array of length 3, and the 3 values are 1,000, baseball glove, and 299. Now, we also mentioned the string position function. And what that will do is it takes as an input a string, and then you provide a additional search string that you want to find out what position that string is located at, or if it even occurs in the string. So here we've provided the string position function with this value $1,099.99, and we're saying we want to find the position of the decimal point. And what we get for output is the answer 5. Now, if we look here, the period, or the decimal point, is actually the 6th character in this string. We have 5 before it and then 1, but the reason it outputs 5 is because the string position function uses a 0 index, or it names the first position of a string as being 0. So the $ is 0, 1 is 1, 0 is position 2, the first 9 is position 3, the second 9 is position 4, and then the decimal point is position 5. So what we can do is, let's say we want to extract, now that we know where the position of the decimal point is, we want to extract out the fractional part of the dollar, or the cents part. Well, we can use the substring function, and that takes as its argument a string, and then it takes 2 integers, one being what position in the string you would like to start extracting a substring from, and from that position it uses the third parameter, length, to decide how many characters from that position you gave it you would like to extract. So in our case, we pass it the same string, which is $1,099.99, and where we want to start is we want the last 2 digits in the number. And basically, because we know that the decimal point before is at position 5, and we want to start at position 6, we output, or we use as our second parameter 5 plus 1, which basically we would use the position of the decimal point at 5, and we add 1 to it to say start at position 6, and then give me a substring of length 2 starting at position 6. And so our output would be 99 because starting at position 6, the next two characters are 99. And then just quickly, as we had kind of talked about before, the string length function outputs the length of a string. So in this case, for the decimal portion of the number that we had just got, if we had saved it in a variable and then input it to the string length function, we would get the output of 2 because the string contains 2 characters. So let's go back to the slides. And now we're going to talk about some different array functions that are commonly used and provided, are built in to PHP. The first one is similar to is the analog to string length, but for arrays it's count, and basically what that does is that returns the number of items or values within an array. Then there's two sort of search functions, inArray and arrayKeyExists. And what those functions do is return true or false depending on whether a value you pass to those functions exists in that array. And, well, in particular, inArray searches, you pass it a value and it searches all the values in the array to see if the value exists. ArrayKeyExists, on the other hand, whatever you pass it as its value, it searches all of the keys of the array to see if that key exists. Additionally, there's two sort functions, or there's many sort functions, but two of the ones we're going to talk about is sort and ksort. And basically what sort does is it sorts a function based on values. So if you had all your values were, let's say, integers in a random order and you ran the sort function on them, it would resort the array so that the functions are now in ascending numerical order, which is the default sorting order. One thing to note is that this does reindex the array, which can be a problem if you use this function on an associative array. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in our example. And that's actually going to be one of the homework challenges, is to use the function reference at php.net to find a function that will sort an associative array by values that maintains the indexes. Also, we have the ksort function, which, like sort, it sorts the function, but it sorts it based on keys. So it sorts the keys in ascending order. And this keeps the key indexes. So let's take a look at a file called arrayfunctions.php, which demonstrates some of these different functions. The count function, you simply, it takes an array as its one argument, and in this case we're passing to the count function an array with the three integers in it, 10, 8, and 9, and it gives us output of 3, stating that there's 3 values or items in the array we pass to it. Now, the inArray function, it takes as its second parameter an array you want to search, and then as its first parameter, it takes a value you want to search for. So in this example, we're saying, we're calling the inArray function. We're saying, I want you to look in this array that has the 3 elements, 10, 8, and 9, and tell me if the value 9 is one of those items in the array. And because it is, it, of course, outputs the value true. Now, you can also do this on associative arrays. Now, associative arrays, we know that this part to the left of the array assignment operator is the key, and then the part to the right of it is the value. So when we run inArray on an associative array, it it searches all of the values of the key, all of the values of the array, which are the values to the right of the array assignment operator. So when we search this array that has 3 items in it, with each item have the different keys C, B, and A, and then they have different values. And we're searching if the value Smith exists, and this function is going to output true because, as you can see, the value of the first item in the array associated with the key C is Smith. And just to show that this only works on values and not on keys, if we were to run the same function using the same array but passed it the value C and say, is C in this array, it's actually going to return false. So even though it's a key and it's in the array, it returns false because inArray only searches the values of an array. Now on the other side of things, we have the array key exists function. And what that does is that it takes an array as input, and then it searches for a particular key. This looks like a typo here. This should say key. And then it returns true or false whether that key exists. So for example, if we run array key exists on an index or numerically indexed array that contains the numbers 10, 8, and 9, well, we know from our lesson on arrays that the first item in a numerically indexed array has index 0, the second item has index 1, and the third item has index 2. So we're saying, and the index is also known as the key, and so we're saying, does the key 2 exist for this array? And the output is true because the element, the value 9, has the index or key of 2. So now we're going to try this on the same associative array before, and we're going to ask if it has the B, the string B as one of the keys in the array, and it's going to return true because this second key value pair has B as its key. And again, to demonstrate that this function only searches keys and not values, if we pass the same array and then ask it to search for the key John, it's going to return no, even though John is in the array, because John in this array is a value and not a key. So now we're going to talk about the sort function, and basically what that does is you pass the sort function in an array, and it sorts the array by values. So it resorts the array in ascending order for values. So if we pass it the array with the numbers 10, 8, and 9 in this sort of random order, the output that the sort function would generate, or what it does to the array we pass it, would be the 0 element would become 8, the first element would become 9, the third element would become 10. So you can see it orders them in ascending order. Now similarly, if we run this on the associative array, we can see that it sorts by values, and it makes the first value in the sorted array equal to B, because that's in ascending order. B's like highest up on the list. Additionally, John would come next in alphabetical order, and then Smith. So as we can see, it's sorted on the different values in alphabetical order. Now the thing to notice that I mentioned on the slide was that this actually re-indexes an array. So in this case, now these ABC keys are lost. And as mentioned, one of the homework examples is going to be to research in the function reference to find a function that will sort this array right here, but after sorting it by value, it will maintain the key associations. Then finally we have the ksort function, and that's a sort by key. And so it takes one argument, which is an array. So if we pass the ksort function, this associative array we've been using all along, it sorts the array by key. So A is higher than B and B is higher than C. So the A key is going to be first in the array now, the B key is going to be second, and the C key is going to be third. And we can see that the values that were associated with each key remain with that key. So this function is a way to sort by key and keep things, the key value associations, together. So now I just want to wrap up by talking about some date and time functions that are available. PHP has a bunch of built-in date and time functions. The first of which we're going to talk about is the date function, which basically returns a formatted date. So you pass it, you can optionally pass it a timestamp for the current date and time, and then you pass it a format string, and based on this string that you pass to it, it will output or format the string in a particular way. They have the time function, which returns what's known as a Unix timestamp. I'm not going to really get into the details of a Unix timestamp, but basically what a Unix timestamp is it's an integer number that represents the current date and time when the function is run. So when you run the function time, it returns an integer of the time right now. And that integer is known as a Unix timestamp. Basically, then we have the getDate function, and what that does is you pass it a timestamp, and it basically from that timestamp, it can separate into parts, the different parts that the timestamp represents. It can separate into hours, minutes, seconds, the day, the year, the month, and so forth. And it returns it as an associative array. Also, there's the make or mktime function that you can use to build a Unix timestamp from supplied date values. Now, one thing to note is that date and time functions have a couple of directives within PHP INI that they use to configure how they work. In particular, the date.timezone directive. And what you do is you can go and set that to a particular date or to a particular time zone identifier value, which can be found at this location here. And that will basically, it'll treat all of your date and times as if they were in that time zone. So if we go and look at date functions.php, we can see examples of all of these different functions that we just talked about. And one thing that you'll notice is, before we get into the details of date, I just want to talk about the time zone directive. Basically, what this function does is outputting the current date and time, and it also outputs the time zone. And right now, the time zone output is CEST, which refers to Europe, Berlin, because that's the default value that was set in PHP INI in the XAMPP configuration. So, because we're filming on the West Coast for this course, we're going to go ahead and update the PHP INI file. And what you can do is, it's quite a long file, but if you search down, far down on the page, there will be a date section. Hopefully I can find it. Here it is. And as you can see, it has the date.timezone directive, and it's set by default in XAMPP as Europe Berlin. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it to West Coast time. So we're going to give it the value America/Los_Angeles. And the reason we use America/Los_Angeles is because that's one of the allowed time zone identifiers, or one of the identifiers that it recognizes. And the way that you can view that is by going to the link that we had in our slide. So for example, if we go to this link right here, it'll tell you all of the different time zones that are available. So we've gone ahead and we've updated our default time zone. Because it's a change to PHP INI, we need to reboot or restart Apache so that the change will take effect. And if we restart it and go back and look at our date function that output the time zone, the abbreviated time zone identifier for Europe Berlin, and we refresh the page, we can see that it changed to PDT, which is the Pacific time zone. Now, where you can find these actually is on the link that we had before, which can be found by, if you look up the date and time extension in the PHP manual, you can find the list of supported time zones, which is, it'd be easier for you to just cut and paste the link that we had before. And you can see that it has a list of different continents and areas in the world. And you can click on an area such as America and see the different values that you're allowed to use. So if you look down here, you can see that for West Coast time, let's see, where is it? Eyes aren't serving me well. Oh, because it was off the screen. You can see that they have one for America, Los Angeles, and you can see that it uses an underscore. But for example, if you were on the East Coast, you could use the America/new_York to use East Coast time. So now let's now that we've sort of set the time zone for this installation of PHP, let's talk about the different functions we had mentioned. Basically, the date function returns a formatted date string. It can take two parameters, and actually if we go and look at the date function in the PHP manual, and again we're going to use the search box up here to make it easy, we can see that it takes a string as its first parameter, and optionally it takes a timestamp, a Unix timestamp, as its second parameter. And the parameter defaults to time, which is the current Unix timestamp if not provided. So if we run this function date, which we are here, with just one parameter, it's going to format our date based on the current time. And as you can see, it explains that in the description. Returns a string formatted according to the given format string using the given integer timestamp, or the current time if no timestamp is given, which is what happens in our case. Now this parameter called format, which is a string, you can see down here, it provides a lengthy description of all of the different values that you can include in this format string. And there are all sorts of different things that you can do. You can use it to output days, months, years, seconds, and you can do it with leading zeros, without. And they're just different ways to extract and format different pieces of a timestamp. So in our example, we've gone ahead and used the formatting string right here. And on your own, you can go ahead and look and research and see how this this format string translates into the output that we get here by looking at this format parameter description that shows all of the different, basically, there's a sort of like formatting characters that you can use to output certain parts of the date. In this case, this formatting string formats the current time because we didn't provide a second parameter, and it says output the date of the month, the year, a comma, and then output the hour, minutes, seconds, using AM or PM, so we're not using military time, and then also output an abbreviated form of the time zone identifier. Now, as mentioned, the time function, which is our next function we're going to talk about, it returns a Unix timestamp for the current date and time, which, when we run this script right now, if we refresh the page, it's going to change. And basically, as mentioned before, a Unix timestamp is an integer that computers know how to work with and can sort of decode into the current into the date and time that it represents. So that's how the time function works. The getDate function basically takes as an input a timestamp, and in this case we could run the getDate function with the time parameter, with the time function as its parameter, and so time is going to generate as its return value the current timestamp, and so getDate knows how to take that timestamp and extract it into different parts, and it outputs an array. And as you can see, it's an associative array that contains all sorts of different keys: seconds, minutes, hours, month, year, and so forth, and basically extracts the date information in the timestamp. So you can see that it knows that when this getDate function was called, it was 4. The hour was 4, the minutes were 9, and the seconds were 46 seconds. And then you can also see that it was June 6, 2011. Excuse me, June 24th, 2011. Now what you can do is, now that you have these date values, you can use the makeTime function to build up a Unix timestamp. So there's sort of different functions for going back and forth between Unix timestamps. So basically the makeTime function works by passing in, it has a specific order of arguments it takes. It first takes hours, then minutes, then seconds, the month, the day in the month, and the year, and it'll generate a Unix timestamp based on that. So if we go ahead and pass it the values that we actually got in this array up here, date array, which was received from the current date and time, and we pass it those values, you can see that it generates a Unix timestamp. And if we notice, because we use the same values that were generated by the getDate function, we should receive or generate the same Unix timestamp as was used in the getDate function. And as we can see, part of the getDate associative array that it returns, the last value in the array with the key of 0 is the Unix timestamp that it used to dissect all the different parts of. And as we can see, because we use the same parts down here in makeTime, these two values match up. So that ends the course material. I just want to talk about a couple of different homework challenges that we have for you that basically are going to give you some experience working with functions and calling functions in more detail and using some of the functions that we went over. In this homework example, which you'll be able to look over, you can see that we're just going to have you convert string to uppercase and lowercase, and then practice chaining functions. So for example, if you pass the string to the lowercase function, it would return all lowercase, and then if you pass an uppercase string to the lowercase function, it would return it to lowercase, and then you pass that value to the uppercase function, it returns it to uppercase. So by chaining those two functions together, you essentially get the original value. So that's one of the things we're going to have you do, and then I'll have you create an array that just contains 5 integers, and basically use the implode function to create a string where the integers are separated by colons. And then, like we did in the course, I'll have you replace the colon delimiter with commas. And then we're going to have you use the string position function in a little bit different way than we use it in the course to find the position of the first comma in our now comma delimited string. And then we're going to use substring to the substring function to remove basically the first integer in our comma delimited string. So we're going to have to remove the integer as well as the comma that precedes it. So just remember when you do that, this string position and substring functions consider the first character to be 0 and not 1. So that'll give you a little experience with that, and it's kind of challenging and a little tricky at first getting used to using these string position and substring functions, so it should be a good exercise. Then I just want to have you run the explode function on our now shortened list of integers, and then because explode generates an array, we'll have you use the count function to verify that the array length is now 4 instead of 5. For this second challenge, I'm going to have you work with some of the array functions we learned about. Basically, I'm going to have you create an associative array of the 12 months in the year in ascending order, so that basically it starts with January, ends with February, where the key is a string value of the number of the month, and then the value is the month name spelled out. And make sure to declare them in ascending order. And then I want you to look at the php.net function reference, and this is to give you practice in learning to use the reference to basically define a function that will sort the array in reverse order. So right now it's sorted from January to December, and I want it to sort the other way around. So one way to quickly find the array functions that are value, a little hint I'm going to give you is that if you type ksort, which we know is sorts an array by keys, if you type that in the function reference box at the top of the page, if we go and do that quickly, instead of having to search the function manual for all of the different array functions, we can see that because ksort's an array function, that actually on the left-hand side it lists all of the other array functions that are available. So I want you to go through and find one of these functions that will basically reverse sort an array and have it sort by the keys, which are numeric. And then you verify that by printing out the array to make sure that it's in reverse order. Then resort the array in ascending order back to its original version using the ksort function that we had learned about, and verify that that's done with print r. And then sort the array by value. And what that's going to do is it's going to sort the months. It's going to sort the array according to the value, which is the month name. However, I don't want you to use the sort array. I want you to research in the function reference again to find a function that will sort an associative array by value but keeps the key associations. Because if we run the sort function on it, basically what it's going to do is it's going to sort the months according to value, which would make April the first one, but it's going to give it an index of 0. In order to keep the index April, which is the 4th month, of 4, you need to find a new function that will maintain that index. So after you find that function and apply it, use print r to verify the sort by value, and if it's done correctly, April should be the first month with a key of 4, and September should be the last month listed with a key of 9. Then just going to have you practice with the array key exists in array function, basically to verify that January is not a key in array but a value, and that it is a value in array. So if you did a search on array key exists, it should come up false. If you did a search on in array using the value January, it should come up true. One thing to note is that these functions return Boolean values, And if you try to echo a Boolean value, as we learned from our typecasting course, the echo statement implicitly casts a Boolean value to its string equivalent. And for true, we know that gets converted to 1. And for false, that gets converted to the empty string. So just sort of keep that in mind when you try to echo the results of these array so that you'll understand that it's not going to output true or false. Finally, for our last homework challenge, I want to have you work with the date and time functions. The first thing I'd like you to do is update the date.timezone directive in your PHP INI file to your current time zone. And remember to restart Apache after you make the change, because any configuration changes require a restart of the web server. And basically what I'd like you to do is use the date function to output the current time in 24-hour format, which would just be the hour and the minutes, and include an abbreviated time zone identifier so that you can know that the change you made up here to the time zone in the PHP INI file works. And what you'll need to do this is you'll need to research the date function in the function reference to learn how to learn how to set that first format parameter you pass to date to get it to output the things you want. So if we look back at the function index, function reference, we go to the date function, you'll have to search this section down here that talks about the format parameter to learn about the different format characters you use in order to output a date in the format you would like. Then I'd like you to use the getDate and time function and chain them together so that getDate will output an array of the current date and time information. And then using that getDate array, like we did in class, I want you to use the value in that array, or the data in that array, with the makeTime function to generate a Unix timestamp that matches the timestamp that was used when you called the getDate function, which, as mentioned, you're going to use the time function. And that's going to sort of replicate what we did in course. And if things work out right, as we've shown, the timestamp that you generate from makeTime should match the last element in the getDate array, which has a key value of 0, and those two should match up. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.